the most exciting panel in living memory, honestly. I'm so excited. Thank you all for joining us.
I found the place.
This cover is really cool. Just wanted to put it in the frame for a second. Awesome book. Gonna be amazing.
Oh, everyone came with copies.
Yes.
Mine's back there.
Give people a few more seconds to file in. You can see and hear us, but we cannot see and hear you. So feel free to eat something noisy. It's not rude. It's encouraged even.
Zoom left.
People a couple more seconds. Thank you all for joining us. All right, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. My name is Ellie. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a bookseller in the Children and Teens Department at Politics and Prose. Thank you for joining us and tuning into this format where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I am thrilled to welcome our guests this evening, who are here celebrating the publication of That Way Madness Lies, 15 of Shakespeare's most notable works reimagined. There's plenty of comedy and tragedy within these pages, but the authors before you wrote for the comedy section, so this event might get a little hilarious. You can click the link we will drop in the chat to get your own copy of the book, which I honestly cannot recommend highly enough. If you have a question for our guests, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of the chat, our guests will have time to answer some of your questions. You can also vote on questions you like and want answered. As always, please remember that this is a creative safe space, and we ask that folks be respectful of one another in the questions and comments. Now, on to the event you are waiting for. Dahlia Adler, who will be our moderator today, is an editor of mathematics by day, LGBTQ reads overlord, and BuzzFeed book blogger by night, and an author of young adult and romance at every spare moment in between. Her novels include the Daylight Falls duology, Just Visiting, the Radley University trilogy, and the upcoming Cool for the Summer. She is the editor of the anthologies His Hideous Heart, That Way Madness Lies, and the upcoming At the Stroke of Midnight, which you can look forward to reading in 2022. Her short stories can be found in these collections, as well as The Radical Element, All Out, and It's a Whole Spiel. Dahlia lives in New York with her family and an obscene number of books. Kay Ancrum is the author of the award-winning thriller The Wicker King, The Weight of the Stars, and the upcoming Peter Pan thriller Darling. Kay is a Chicago native, passionate about diversity and representation in young adult fiction. She currently writes most of her work in the lush gardens of the Chicago Art Institute. Lily Anderson, who will hopefully join us when her Zoom, if Zoom allows, fell in love with the bard when she was 10 and never looked back. In the 20 years since, she has performed, adapted, and directed Shakespeare plays, as well as retelling Much Ado About Nothing as her debut novel. The Only Thing Worse Than Me Is You. Her other works include Not Now, Not Ever, and Undead Girl Gang. Mark Oshiro is the young adult author of Anger is a Gift, winner of the 2019 Schneider Family Book Award and nominated for a 2019 Lammy Award, as well as Each of Us a Desert, and their middle grade debut, The Insiders. When they are not writing, crying on camera about fictional characters for their online Mark Does Stuff universe, or traveling, Mark is busy trying to fulfill their lifelong goal to pet every dog in the world. Austin Sigmund Broca and Emily Wibberley are the authors of Always Never Yours, If I'm Being Honest, Time of Our Lives, and What's Not to Love. They met in high school, where they fell in love over a shared passion of Shakespeare. Austin went on to study English at Harvard so he could continue to impress Emily with his literary analysis, while Emily studied adolescent psychology at Princeton. They live in Los Angeles, where they've combined their interests and decided to write short stories of high school literature and first love. Anna Marie McLemore is the queer Latinx non-binary author of The Weight of Feathers, a William C. Morris debut award finalist, Stonewall Honor book When the Moon Was Ours, Wild Beauty, a Kirkus, SLJ, and Booklist Best Book of 2017, Blanca Roja, one of Time Magazine's 100 Best Fantasy Novels of All Time, Dark and Deepest Red, a Winter 2020 Indie Next title, and the recently released The Mirror season. Thank you so much for joining us. I am so excited about the panel.
I just want to state before we get started that bio was written in the before times. I am not traveling anywhere. That's not happening. I do love it. I'm not going anywhere. This is as far as I go.
I just find everyone's bios really daunting. fine. That's totally fine. Hi, everyone. I am Dahlia Adler. Pronouns are she, her. Sorry, they didn't make it into there, but I'm so excited to have everyone. I am so lucky to have edited all these authors. I still can't believe I get to do that. That's just the greatest perk of editing anthologies of all time. And I'm really excited to talk about the comedies that these authors have reimagined for That Way Madness Lies. So I'm going to ask everyone to go around and share a little bit about their story. How about we start with Mark?
Yes. So I almost picked up Kayla's book and held it up, and I was like, no, I didn't write that. Yeah. So I got to reimagine my favorite Shakespeare play, which is Twelfth Night. My story is called Shipwreck. It is about a group of 4 teenagers who are attending a shipwreck-themed dance, and it is a story of queer love, mistaken identity, and also coming into your identity for the first time. I just wanted to write disaster gays really badly, and that's basically, Dahlia was like, here you go. I just really loved getting to write something that was funny and heartfelt and full of just messy teenagers who don't quite talk to each other how they should. And so I think that is actually a huge theme or an element of a lot of Shakespeare plays, is people talking at each other and they're not quite getting one another's meaning. And how do you play off of that? So that's a little bit about my story.
Emily and Austin, how about you?
Yeah, we wrote Severe Weather Warning, which is a reimagining of The Tempest, which we gamely tried to turn into a rom-com. Do you want to?
Yeah, this is largely because The Tempest is such a strange play. It's late in Shakespeare's career, and it's so odd. It's full of weird supernatural streaks and some missteps and strange slapstick comedy interacting with this deep familial story of forgiveness. And so adapting such a weird but also prescient and often beautiful play into a contemporary comedy was the kind of challenge we were very game for.
And so we changed it to be about a girl who is stuck in her house during a tornado warning with her younger sister, who has just broken up with her boyfriend, who is also there, and that boyfriend's older brother. So it is a very awkward situation for everyone.
Yeah. All right, Kayla.
I adapted Taming of the Shrew, and I am very, almost embarrassingly, am a fan fiction and fandom scholar. It is my passion. It is my life. So I decided to include my 2 favorite tropes, which is the soulmates AU and also trapped in a closet. So it is a Taming of the Shrew soulmates alternate universe story about Catherine and Petruchio, who are soulmates for each other. And when you find your soulmate, you go from seeing in black and white to seeing in color. And they run into each other at a party, and Petruchio pulls her into a closet. And it's like kind of like a funnier, a little bit more lighthearted and heartfelt version of an incredibly intense, misogynistic, but glorious comedy.
Hold that thought, because we will definitely be getting to that. But Anna Marie, how about you?
Okay, so Dahlia, when you talked with me about this and I realized I was going to be doing Midsummer Night's Dream, it was like, okay, like making the fairies gay. My whole life has been leading up to this. I've been training my whole life for this. So I kind of love and hate Midsummer Night's Dream. I love it because fairies and forests. I hate it because racism. So I wanted to take apart that part of it. So this is all about like queer, brown, trans fairies, and also pairing up everyone from the original play, as I sort of like thought that they should have been, like Demetrius and Lysander together, like Hermia and Helen are together. It was all just like, it was all for show. Like, so, and like Puck and Oberon are together. I just had fun with it. I loved writing this story. I loved like making this as gay as I always wanted it to be the first time I read it. And also giving this character like the like one brown character in the play who was like an afterthought, like letting her be the center of the whole story.
Make everything gay. Let no one ask why I work with you as often as possible. But this is perfect segue into my next question, which is, I actually really love the way people have been describing this anthology as like the perfect collection for if you have a love-hate relationship with Shakespeare. I think that's awesome. And I would love to hear how well you think that fits you and how that describes what you did with your story. So Anne-Marie, you were kind of in the middle of it, so I'm just going to shoot right back to you.
Okay, so this was something where reading the original play, like any discussions that I heard that I was part of, I was like, wait, are we not going to talk about this? Are we not going to talk about like the one brown character in this play who's basically a plot device? So I wanted to imagine this character grown up, and I wanted to imagine what happened when this character met another brown fairy and was like, oh, there are other people like me. And that's something that was close to my heart, both as someone like Latinx, someone mixed race, and also someone queer and someone trans. That moment of like, oh, there are other people like me. There are other people in these spaces that I can connect with. So that was how I sort of spoke to the part where I was like, wait, are we never going to address this in like the different discussions that I heard, while getting to like play with the stuff that I love about like all of these like antics in the woods and this magic in the woods. So I got to keep the parts that I loved and that pulled me in, and also like speak to the parts that felt like unanswered questions.
Very cool. And Kaylee, I got to jump back into that misogyny point.
I don't really have like a love-hate relationship with this story. I think it's absolutely, and I'm an English major, so I have like a full queer theory reading, a feminist reading sort of perspective of this specific story. But I very much, while writing this, in particular with the understanding that I'm writing for kids, and that it's important to kind of like consider their perspective and what part of their life that they're in, and whether or not they're learning certain lessons about what it means to be a woman or what it means to treat women certain ways. What I was going to create for this adaptation. I think that Taming of the Shrew is very much a sitcom. Like, it might as well be an episode of The King of Queens. Like, it's very like formulaic in that way. We have learned from it and created very many versions of it in our own kind of like modern understanding of, men and women bickering, and the comedy of it being what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, and whose appropriate place is it. And the general, ending of somebody's behavior needs to change as the overarching like theme of Taming of the Shrew. In the original version, absolutely from a social perspective, definitely Catherine. But for today's audience, I think it might be Petruchio. So instead of writing a story about how she received her comeuppance for not appropriately behaving to the social norms of the environment that she's in, and making things difficult for many people all around her, to the point where when she gets her just desserts, you're like, yes. I wanted to create a story where Catherine gets to stay the same, and Petruchio is the one who has to change. So she remains in all of her painful brightness. And instead of being a cloak to cover that, he is a mirror.
Cool. I like that. And Emily and Austin, you guys have like a super love relationship with Shakespeare.
Generally speaking, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
we choose the works that we love the most and draw out the things in them.
I mean, that said, though, when we were writing, if I'm being honest, when I read the play, I was like, this is Taming of the Shrew.
We were very damning.
It was like, how are we going to do this? Like Kayla was saying, it's like there's a lot in here that's very difficult to swallow.
And we were pretty array critical.
And so in that book, we did truly like criticize him on the page, and there's certainly much that needs to be updated, and that people, and like, this is not like, what Dahlia has done is fantastic, but if people are trying to say that she's the only person to like ruin Shakespeare by bringing all this into it, like,
sure,
people have been doing this for hundreds of years. We've had people of color and women throughout history who have been like interpreting these plays and making them for new audiences. So Dahlia is part of a grand tradition, not just like somebody coming along and stomping all over it.
Right, being a party pooper, right. And in Tempest, that was very much our take. There's as I was saying, there's so much in the play that it is very possible to extricate and jettison the stuff that is impossible to work with, to endorse, and frankly, sometimes to comprehend. And instead to focus on one thing that Shakespeare was able to do very well, which is to capture awkwardness and pain, and also irony and laughter and forgiveness between people, and bring those elements forward into a contemporary setting.
And I think too, something worth noting is that Shakespeare himself was adapting and was taking things and changing them for his own audiences.
Mercilessly.
So it's really, I think all of these stories are very fluid and they invite this kind of interpretation.
Yeah.
Just to give that some background, I was telling everybody before how I had received some very angry mail from somebody who thought I was very evil for messing with the classics. I actually don't know whether that was commentary on His Hideous Heart or That Way Madness Lies. It came from publication of the two. And certainly I didn't do this on my own. I mean, this is a panel of people who've done it right along with me. Some of you not even for the first time. So let's all destroy everything together, shall we? All right, Mark.
Kayla, I love that you brought up approaching this and thinking of it in terms of like how fan fiction functions, because one of the things, I think like everyone, I went back and reread Twelfth Night and remembered why I loved it so much and why it was so funny. And then I also spent time just grimacing and being like, oh, I can't put that in there. And in Twelfth Night in particular, two of the things that I understand why they are funny, I understand why they are the way they are, but I was like, I can't actually have that be what it is there are hints, there's so much like textual queerness, but also subtextual, like things that are not quite there, but you also know that Shakespeare is playing with certain tropes and playing with certain expectations. And then the big one, of course, is that there are characters who do not dress as their gender identity, where it is presented as a joke, and that is when someone who falls in love with someone who's presenting in a certain gender, and instead of it being about like, oh, these characters are queer, it's oh, ha ha ha, there's all this like misconnections and weird miscommunications. And so as I was approaching it, was I still want to have the missed connection or the miscommunication, because I think those are huge staples of romantic comedies, and I still wanted to keep it funny and romantic. So how do I do that? And so I ended up making the choice to have someone, this dance that they go to is the first time they're fully stepping into their identity as being non-binary. And then how that then gets them confused for their twin brother. And so you have a case mistaken identity, but the end result isn't, oh my God, how funny it is that I mistook you. It's like, oh wait, but if we were into each other, then we're just into each other. That's how this works. Like, and then also making Sebastian and Antonio, like they are deeply in love with one another, but the miscommunication is each one thinks the other person just thinks they're friends. Like we're just friends, and neither one of them know that they actually both feel the same thing. And so I love getting to play with that. And still, for me, it was, I want to honor the spirit of Twelfth Night, but just take it in a new direction. And I think that's what's fun about doing these kind of adaptations.
Definitely. And speaking of adaptations, so anything written by anyone here aside, what's your favorite adaptation of a Shakespearean comedy, be it book or movie? Austin, Emily?
Definitely 10 Things I Hate About You.
Yeah.
For sure.
I was actually going to phrase it, what's your favorite and why is it 10 Things I Hate About You?
I know. It's
on the living Twitter account, but
for sure.
Is anything not 10 Things I Hate About You?
Yeah.
Do you have one that's not?
That's
I gotta
not.
think about
I
that.
got. I'll come back to it if I can. But
mine
I feel like
is
the
Boz
Romeo and
Luhrmann.
Juliet is an option with
That's-
Leonardo
yeah.
DiCaprio.
Boz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. I love it. I think it has the best Benvolio and Mercutio on the face of the planet. Like on the face of the planet. I think what's interesting about that is I remember when it came out too, there were so many detractors, which happens every time someone radically adapts Shakespeare. There's always people who are like, you ruined it. It's terrible. How dare you do this? And I think Boz Luhrmann's adaptation is so him and so ostentatious and over the top. And yet there's so much care in the way he references things. Like there was a huge thing going on around Twitter a couple of weeks ago about the choice of guns in the film and what the guns represent both historically and visually. And I'm like, this is someone who clearly loves Shakespeare and is spending every moment, like, how can I put as much of my love into this while also being like, I am free to do what I want, basically. And so that one's always been my favorite adaptation.
Anyone else? Anna Marie, Kayla?
Is this specific to Shakespeare adaptations, or are we just talking about general?
You know what? You can talk about general.
Okay, so
You have the Peter Pan coming up.
I do, but that one's not my favorite. There's this book that's called Spindle's End. It is a Sleeping Beauty adaptation from ages ago, back when I was a kid, 1998, something like that. It's a Sleeping Beauty adaptation that starts with the scene where they all the fairies are around Sleeping Beauty, and they're like, oh, give her like the most beautiful blonde hair and the gorgeous blue eyes and cheeks like a sunset, but they all forget to ask for her to be hot, so she looks really terrible. And they're just kind of like, oh no. Just looking at the baby, and then the sorceress is like, you didn't invite me to the party, and she's all mad, and then the baby gets cursed. And what they wind up doing is just kind of like giving her away to like a couple in the woods, and then she like goes off into the forest and gets like really buff. Meanwhile, like back in the castle, they found some village girl that looked vaguely like how they wanted the princess to look, and like made her the princess. And it's just literally how everything just kind of like gets so much worse because of all of those decisions. It's one of the funniest adaptations I've ever read, but has like the most like heart-rending love story between the actual princess and her like super hot, really buff blacksmith boyfriend. And it's everything I've ever wanted in an adaptation, and you should definitely check it out.
That's amazing. All right, Anna Marie, you can pick from anything also. Deal.
I'm thinking about Shakespeare. Kayla, that's definitely going on my list.
Yeah.
You've convinced me. Okay, so I will name Lily's The Only Thing Worse Than Me Is You. I love that book. I love that. I love that interpretation of Much Ado About Nothing. And I'll also randomly shout out the all women's production of Romeo and Juliet I saw when I was 14 or 15, and that left me very, very confused for a good couple of years. So I'm sending my love back to that production.
I see there's a Q&A question, so I'm actually going to jump over to it because this is sort of in the same vein. Are there any other classics you would love to retell? Have you done any other adaptations? And I know there's some Shakespeare in this group, and I just mentioned, Peter Darling. I mean, not Peter Darling, sorry, that is by Austen Chant. It's great. But Darling, which is Peter Pan. Kayla, why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then we can pass that question around.
So I have a Peter Pan readaptation coming out. It's one of 3 between Aiden's Lost in the Neverwoods that came out yesterday, and there's another book called Wendy Darling, which I believe is also a fantasy. Darling is a serial killer thriller where Peter Pan is a serial killer. And it is actually a direct adaptation. I just kind of like took the actual book, and it's actually by chapter adaptation. So librarians can actually, or teachers can read it with their classes. And I took that and I just kind of like placed it in modern society. There are like direct parallels for every character. Captain Hook, Detective Inspector Hook. All of the Lost Boys are homeless and foster children. The mermaids are drag queens. There is a wonderful burlesque drag queen that is the Neverbird. And the entire story is set in one night, kind of like, actually I called it Nick and Nora's Infinite Police Procedural. And it's about running around in the night with Peter Pan as he's, killing people, and everyone's kind of like, oh my God, stop doing that. But yes, it is coming out June 22nd.
Awesome. So into it. Mark?
I don't know. I don't know. It's so interesting because the things that I have adapted before, they're all like secrets. I don't really talk about it. Like, for example, so I don't get to often talk about it. Each of Us a Desert is basically a young adult version of M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. And everyone who's read it is like, oh, like once they hear it, they're like, Oh, it's a village. Yeah. Except my adaptation is I got really mad at that movie, and it's been 18 years, and I haven't let go how angry I am at that movie. So I wrote a whole novel in response. Which, by the way, anger, people don't know this either. Anger is a Gift is a response to one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so I tend to do this: is I get mad at something, and then I write a novel like the response to it. So I've done that. I don't know. I was thinking like, what are like classic stories I would love to do? And I honestly, the only one that ever seemed like interesting to me to like just completely, because here's the thing, I like chaotic adaptations, like where you like take a core idea and then you just throw it into space, or sometimes literally. I just meant like, like just it's just so far out there. And I have an idea that has not formed into a full actual story where I really, really want to do Snow White, but I want to make it horror. I want to make it just the creepiest, because the thing is like the Disney animated movie version of Snow White gave me nightmares as a kid. I didn't like it. It terrified me. I think a lot of those old animation has like imagery in it that is very frightening. Like I've only seen Fantasia once because the broomstick sequence, I don't like it. I hate it. It's like they're like clowns but brooms. Like, and I also hate clowns. So I really want to do like a horror retelling of Snow White, but I can't figure out what it is besides like I just have creepy images. So I don't know. Maybe someday that'll be the thing that comes out. I don't know.
Let's talk, Mark. I have much experience in turning a series of creepy images into a retelling.
Oh, I know. I was hoping you would respond to that too, because you do. I think of like in Blanca Roja in particular, there are so many. The thing I want to do is I think is present in so many fairy tales, in particular classic ones, is there's body horror, but no one actually talks about the body horror. But you do, Anna Marie, like you talk about it and you like go into like, what does it mean when your body transforms, and how is it sometimes actually not horror? It's a good thing. It's a wonderful, beautiful transformation. And that's like the angle I want to take. I think I just need to also just not be on deadline and be able to have time to like write an actual like proposal for this. But I don't know. Yes, we do need to talk.
On that note, Anna Marie,
we do, because I'm excited for this. Okay. So let's make sure I get them all.
Yeah.
The Weight of Feathers is Romeo and Juliet, only with two rival families of traveling performers, the Palomas, who are a Mexican-American family, who are mermaids, who perform in the lakes and rivers wherever they travel, and the Corbeaus, who are descended from a family of tightrope walkers and who perform in trees with these enormous wings. I think my next retelling after that is Blanca Roja, which is queer Latinx non-binary Snow White and Rose Red meets Swan Lake. Dark and Deepest Red is a reimagining of Hans Christian Andersen's The Red Shoes, but through the lens of the 1518 Strasbourg dancing plague, which, and I only found this out partway through my research, is actually the specific dancing plague that has these like secret historical threads with the story of the Red Shoes. And my one that just came out, The Mirror Season, is very lightly inspired by the Snow Queen. This is a story about two sexual assault survivors who find their fates intertwined and who find themselves helping each other find their voices and their paths forward during a season of vanishing trees and enchanted Pont Dulce. So the next book I'm writing is not a retelling, but apparently Macmillan could not get enough of my retellings because they have asked me to do The Great Gatsby for next year, which I am very excited about. It will have a title soon. For now, it is The Gay Gatsby.
Yeah, it is.
It's going to be very gay, and I'm over the moon. I'm writing Jay Gatsby as a trans guy, which is just like would have been my dream when I was first reading this in high school.
Awesome. And Austin and Emily.
Our debut, Always Never Yours, was a Romeo and Juliet retelling, but from the perspective of the girl who is perpetually not Juliet. She is the Rosaline in Romeo and Juliet, always the girl before. And we wanted her to be thrust into the spotlight, and she is going to play Juliet in her production of Romeo and Juliet. And then I'm happen to have this because we're using our copies as our computer stand right now. But this is our second book, which is,
if I'm being honest, this is our Taming of the Shrew takeoff, excoriation, call it what you will, about the trope of the bitchy popular girl who goes on her own journey of self-interrogation and reinvention and ultimately renewal as she thinks about the play, but also about those she's wronged in her own life. It was great adapting these two Shakespearean works. We love to sort of interact with them, skewer them, look at them from the perspective of characters whose story it is often not. Going forward, we'd love to get our hands on some Jane Austen for sort of the same reason. Both of these writers were entertainers, social commentarians, and philosophers with a knack for speaking out of both sides of their mouth. And that is the kind of stuff we like to interact with.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you guys would do such a good job with Austen.
Hope so.
I love that I come away from these panels like just desperate for you all to write everything you're talking about. I'm actually going to jump back to Kayla because I made you talk about your book, but I didn't give you a chance to talk about what else you want to do. And I know that you have awesome plans with that. And I know that you think that like they're too out there, but they're so awesome. And like for anybody who didn't get to hear Kayla talk about them on our Women in Shakespeare panel, I'm going to give you another shot now.
Oh, I have kind of like a joke one, and then I have like a real one. I'm about to start like shopping around, so you guys will get to hear about this ages and ages before it like appears. But my real one is that I am writing a interpretation of the story Icarus, and I'm writing it about a boy and his father who habitually rob a rich guy's house of his art and reproduce the art and put the fake art in his house and sell the real art for money. And it's about how, while the process of doing that, the son, whose name is Icarus, breaks into his house and accidentally runs into the guy's son, who is the very first intersex character that I'll have in my work. And I'm an intersex author, and lots of people have asked me if I had intersex characters, and I said no, and I felt really bad. So I created this story to see if I could sell work about my own marginalization. And my joke one is that I really want to write a Frankenstein readaptation where there's more emphasis on the fact that Frankenstein was supposed to be, like, the monster was supposed to be hot. I think that there was a lot of discussion about how he was made of all the hot guy parts, and then no discussion about how he is a hot guy afterwards. And I feel like I could do a really good job of making all of the reactions to seeing him like lumber out of nowhere be about him just being too tall. I think that that is like enough for the people of that community. And I think that, there, alongside with that, I feel like there's very little discussion about the concept of being a god and trying to create something that is supposed to be like of ultimate beauty and succeeding, but like not in a way that you really like, but like he didn't fail, he succeeded, and but if I will be allowed to write that, that would be a great joy for me.
So into them both, just so into them both. There are more questions coming, so I'm going to jump back into the Q&A. Since you've all written novels, what is different / similar to write shorter form? So, Anna Marie, I think you have the most short stories among us, maybe. I think you have some sort of like record for appearance in YA anthologies. So I'm definitely curious how you find the difference.
Oh gosh, this is the worst possible panel for me to be talking about this, because I don't know if I ever told you this, Delia. Like, my first version of this story was about 40,000 words long, and then I was
tell me that.
I was just like, oh, oops, this isn't going to work. So I had so much I wanted to say in this one that this was one where I had to kind of distill down. But the thing that I found with writing short stories versus writing novels is it's really about one moment, at least for me, when I'm writing short stories. There's just one transformative moment that happens in a short story. And even that can get away from you pretty quickly, and you can start imagining how that might be its own novel. but for me, that's kind of how I approach them a little differently.
Anyone else want to take it?
Yeah,
Dahlia
I'll
also did it too.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say Dahlia should also chime in too.
Oh, no, I'll give it to Mark. I'll talk a little after I say that. Another question asking me to finally talk, so I'll throw it in.
Yeah, which if you hadn't gotten to it, I was going to bully you into answering, because I actually think I really think we should hear it, because a lot of people don't understand what an anthology editor does. Like, and I would love to hear it from you.
Sure
I would love to hear it from you. So yeah, like Anna Marie, I approach it as a moment, or I'm going to quote my boo Danielle Clayton, because we've had a lot of conversation, because we both write a lot of short stories too. It's this idea of, like, in a novel, I'll tackle so many different issues, but in a short story, I just have one question I need answered for a character, for a moment, for a scene, or whatever it is. And so for me, a short story is, how can I tell a story where I just have the focus on one thing? What is that one character? What is that one moment? What is the one twist? You know, I got to be in a We Need Diverse Books anthology last year in December, or that came out in December. And that one was less about answering a question for a character, but I had this twist in mind for years that I always wanted to pull off. And so the whole story is anchored on something that happens on the last page. And so I thought of the short story as, how do I earn it? How do I get to a point where the reader will go along with this whole story and then get there, and then I just stab them in the heart? Not literally, but, you know, as we do sometimes as authors. And then with this one, the question wasn't about twists, even though there are twists about these characters and them revealing themselves to one another and revealing their truth, but just what does love and affection look like now? What does it look like now in a situation where you don't know how to communicate with other people because you're so afraid and you're so scared of being your true self? And so that was what Shipwreck was these people will come into their truth. What does that look like when you finally do? And it's just joy. It's just queer joy. Like, at the end of the day, I just wanted to write a story where the stakes aren't like, the world's ending, everyone's dying. It's, will I get to kiss you at some point? Like, that's it. Like, that's the worst stake in the whole story. And I really like getting the chance to do that.
That's awesome. That's true. You do have a bunch of stories also. God, I feel like I'm very behind. I haven't read that anthology yet. There's a few I haven't gotten to crack into yet. But I was asked to talk about my own contribution and about being an editor. So I am going to talk about that a little bit. My story is called I Bleed, and it is a reimagining of The Merchant of Venice. The love-hate relationship 1000% applies here. As a Jewish author and reading The Merchant of Venice as a Jewish teenager and in a Jewish school, which is kind of like the safest place to be exposed to it without hearing anybody else's thoughts on the incredibly anti-Semitic representation in that story. It's, you know, on the one hand, kind of like, oh my God, we have such significant representation in this story by Shakespeare. And that feels kind of incredible because, you know, you can kind of count on two hands where you're like really, really seeing yourself in classic literature. Not gonna lie, I never read Ivanhoe. But you know, the representation is not good. But it is and it isn't, because that Shylock monologue, which actually opens I Bleed, everybody had to include an epigraph at the beginning, and then it was optional to do it at the end, to take some text from the original to really contextualize your work. So I used Shylock's monologue to open mine. And my story is about a boy, a Jewish boy named Shy Lockheimer, because I'm not subtle. Even though I have a Jewish friend whose last name is Locke, but I just couldn't do Shylock. So there were Lockheimers at my school, and in high school, and I just stole that name instead. And he has been relentlessly bullied by this white supremacist kid, and he gets the chance to take revenge in the form of a pound of flesh, and he does it. And so a very big difference for me, well, there's two different ways that I write short stories, which is something that completely terrified me until I was invited to my first anthology, which was The Radical Element, edited by the wonderful Jessica Spotswood. And I just wanted to work with her and give it a shot so badly that I said yes, even though I was terrified to do it. And that short story is actually my other Jewish main character. that's about girls in American history. And with that story and my story in All Out and It's a Whole Spiel, it was more about getting a character arc, and it's just, how do I get this character from where they start to where I want them ending up? And the whole short story is a character arc, and generally light on plot, which, you know, can be you or cannot be for you. And then with these retellings, so I retold Ligeia as Ligeia in His Hideous Heart, and then Merchant of Venice here. I actually try to get in as much of the original story as possible, retelling it from start to finish, but just the main plot, not subplot. So I pulled out things from Merchants of Venice I really, really hated, but I just stuck with, you know, all the stuff about Jessica. So it's, you know, Shylock and Antonio and Bassanio and Portia, and like, that's it as far as characters really go in my retelling. And that's really trying to get from point A of the main plot to point Z. So it's a little bit different. I wish I was better at focusing on like that one question. I feel like that's a more consistent, solid way to write short stories. But as long as I'm doing these reimaginings, I really like trying to kind of do the whole thing. I'm going to pause and go to another question before I talk more about being an editor, because even I've had enough of my own voice at this point in time. So I will get back to that, but I promise I will address it. And I am going to go to the question that's at the top. So as you've mentioned, there's a rich history of retelling Shakespeare. What's the value in retelling or adapting a classic story instead of, or along with, publishing or staging works that are completely new? Parentheses, I'm a huge fan of retellings, and I have my own answer to this question, but I would love to hear your thoughts. So yes, I mean, especially now as we're seeing all this work rebooted and we're all like, buy original books already instead of making like the 7th version of Golden Girls. I know they're not actually doing that, but they should do that. So what do you see as the value of doing retellings, you know, alongside this? Austin and Emily, you guys must have thoughts.
For sure, absolutely. I mean, every retelling does one of two things, or really does two things in different measures, and one is endorsement and the other is attack. And any retelling can do either in whatever measure, as long as it does them both in the right directions. Shakespeare retellings are the perfect ground for this. As everyone here has discussed, you know, this was a like upper middle class white dude writing in literally 1600, like straight up 1600. So there's plenty that he didn't understand about society, the world, religion, gender, everything. And so there's a lot to attack. There's also, though, I think, a value in reminding people that human sorenesses and joys were in some ways very similar then, and that what you are going through now may resemble not only what other characters in the contemporary world or in fantastical worlds might resemble, but literally the thoughts, the wounds, the hopes that people were going through, again, in literally 1600. And so by taking the parts of those stories that we love, which tend to be some of those fundamental human elements, we are drawing on that way of interacting with Shakespeare.
And I think that like we all take inspiration from all stories. So like this idea that like it is just this one text and you close the book and nobody will interact with it ever again, it doesn't really exist. Like we all read something and we're like, oh, I love this part of the story. If I were to do this story, it would look like this. And then while that's not actually like a retelling, maybe it's fan fiction, maybe it's your own book. Like we are doing that constantly as writers. And sometimes it's just nice to be able to pitch it specifically as a Romeo and Juliet retelling in order to like get people to understand what you're talking about, like from the blink.
Actually, your mention of fan fiction makes me want to kick this to Kayla very badly. Because one question that I have for authors, because a lot of authors get their start in fan fiction and they don't necessarily stop, you know. Plenty of authors are still writing it even as they are, you know, on deadline for the books they've got. So how do you kind of make the determination what's sticking to, you know, fan fiction and the writing for you, and what's, I want to turn this into an adaptation?
I think my opinion about just like adaptations in general is really tied to my understanding of the history of transformative fan works and how human beings kind of relate to stories in general. The way I kind of talk about it when I'm doing lectures about it is that stories, we consume them in the same way that we consume food. We need them as a part of our kind of like daily, the daily things that we consume to thrive. Whether it's stories that are, you know, like actual books or like movies or even just like celebrity gossip or something. We need these stories to kind of like be able to continue going. And when we don't have them, we create them for ourselves, even in solitude. And our relationship with storytelling and storytelling culture has always, from the very beginning, included transformative fan works. Especially when you start looking back at like fairy tales and like cross-cultural fairy tales and the like trail of fairy tales as they spread like globally and stuff like that. The way that we relate to stories is both, you know, as a passive consumer, but also as a kind of like an interactive experience. Fan fiction in particular is something that I think is very like a very post-industrial concept, that we have like it's our own category for that. And it mostly was just kind of like unapproved adaptions. And our desire to create our own version of something or to readapt it or change small things and share it with other people is just kind of like another expression of our love for and our desire to interact with stories as a whole. So when I talk about like fan fiction in regards to, you know, the kind of fan fiction people make about like Supernatural or Teen Wolf or, you know, like all of that stuff and everything in academic spaces, like people really aren't here, you know, to hear people talk about that stuff because there isn't a lot of respect towards that work. But it is functionally not terribly dissimilar from a lot of the work that we do professionally with approved versions of our concepts. And I think that when it comes to like readers and the publishing industry and its current structure, adaptions exist for the same reason that fan fiction exists, because it's snack food, it's comfort food. It's, you know, there for us to know what we're getting into and to either be surprised along the way or to just stuff our faces with something that we already know that we love. And I think that there's something very, very human and very adorable about that.
I definitely agree with that. Anna Marie, do you have anything you want to say about it? You who have also a lot of adapted, but maybe more loosely.
So some of how I think about this is Kayla was talking about fairy tales, and that's exactly like a lot of what my fairy tale heart is. The fact that like these stories are here in different traditions, even if the one that is most recognizable, particularly in this country, is a very westernized version of it. Like there's a version of Snow White and Rose Red that I knew growing up. That's a Mexican version of it. It's different, but there are also a lot of parallels to it. That's not one that a lot of people know in this country, but it's one that I knew, and it's one that meant a lot to me. Another thing that comes to mind a lot is thinking about my own family traditions, my own ancestors' traditions, and how like we originally spoke languages that weren't written down. They were shorthanded, but they weren't written down in the way people think of. So when you told stories, more than how you would think of them now, they were adaptations, they were retellings, because when you have oral traditions, when you have oral languages, that's going to give stories the space to live and move and breathe and change in a way that I think is perhaps not as familiar to some communities in this country. I think it is to a lot of us, but I think sometimes that's a little jarring for people to think about, like, oh, like what happened in oral traditions, oral like stories passed down that way. And I think of that the same way in my family, like the stories in my family that get retold, and that get passed down. Some details will remain the same, and some of them will change. The locations of somewhere will change, the details will change. So in that way, I grew up around this tradition of adapting and retelling stories.
Mark, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, everything that's already been said. I actually want to loop back around to something Kayla said very, very early on when you were talking about Darling in particular, because I think it's something that those of us who are writing kid lit have this very interesting opportunity, is that we are living in a time when I feel like, English educators, particularly in North America, have a chance to directly challenge what is canon and what is taught, not just read, but taught in the classrooms. And I think all of us have had our work in classrooms at this point, which is a very surreal thing, because growing up, I thought you had to be old, white, and dead, and that's the only way your book gets into a classroom, because generally speaking, that's what you read. And so I didn't know you could be a living author and have your work discussed in that specific setting. And so I think one of the really, really interesting things about this anthology in particular, and with his hideous heart as well, is that you can teach a classic work in conjunction with modern retellings and talk about what are the themes that are similar, what are dissimilar, how does an author approach something in particular. I think that is an amazing thing that is, I've already seen librarians and teachers talking about, I cannot wait to fold this into my curriculum. I can't wait during we have, I know there's, I can't remember where it was, there's this high school that does a Shakespeare week, and they're going to fold the book. I have to find the tweet again, Dahlia, and send it to you, because I got so excited, and then Twitter did that thing where it immediately refreshed, and I was like, I hate you, you're the worst. It's happening. I'll give a really interesting example, is that, there are English teachers who are bound by district rules here, or school rules, in terms of here are the things you have to teach this year or whatnot. And there's this teacher in the Midwest who has basically for each grade level, in high school, so 8, 9, 10, or whatever the years are, they have 4 or 5 books they have to teach during the English course. And so what they do is they pair each one of them. And so I got to do this school visit, and I was warned ahead of time and still could not wrap my mind around it. They were like, we taught your book, Anger's Again, in conjunction with Catcher in the Rye. And the whole time I was going to this thing, I was like, I don't get it. Why would you compare those two? And then I got to sit in this classroom while these kids start comparing things like class and access. And how could a character like Holden spend all of his day in New York City alone and no one hassles him? And here's a book about a young teenager who is hassled constantly by, and I was just sitting there like, this blows my mind. I can't believe it. But then I had that moment where I was like, what if I had gotten something like this? And I will say I had fantastic English teachers who, in the last event I talked about, we read Shakespeare as a freshman, and our reward for reading it was watching Shakespeare in Love. That same teacher taught us Bless Me Ultima, The House on Mango Street, which changed my whole life. So I was lucky enough to be exposed to that. But I think that is an interesting thing, specifically for young adult and middle grade retellings, is that you can take it on an educational route in a way to get kids to rethink what it means to be a writer and what it means to be creative. And I love that. I love the idea that anything that we write can just open up that possibility for someone else.
I mean, that's pretty much the ethos behind these anthologies. And it's, wild to see them used in schools. I love that, because the novels I write are not really bring into your classroom books. So it's not even something that I ever dreamed of being able to do. And I guess I'll fold this into talking a little bit about editing the anthologies, as I was asked. But this for me is miraculous that I have anything to do with books that get into classrooms. But it is an incredible way to, anthologies always are great for finding new authors and seeing your favorite authors do something really different. And for authors, certainly for me, getting to write something that you're not necessarily ready to or even inclined to write in long form. I've written 2 Jewish main characters in anthology stories before I had a Jewish main character in a novel. Cool for the Summer, coming out in May, is going to be my first one. It just wasn't something that I wanted to do in a novel yet, but short stories let me dip my toe in. Sorry, this is my 3rd. So that's something that anthologies have definitely done for me. As an editor, you technically, I guess, don't have to write a story for it. But so far I have both times, and each time I'm like, maybe I'll go easy on myself, because it is a lot of work. You have to find the perfect authors, and thankfully I did. And for Shakespeare, something that was, for That Way Madness Lies, something that was very different from his Hideous Heart is I wanted to very specifically have an equal number of comedies and tragedies. So I couldn't just ask 15 authors at once, because if 10 of them wanted to do tragedies and 5 wanted to do comedies, then I'm in a bad place. So I was sort of inching in a little at a time and asking, starting with authors where I was like pretty sure I knew what they were going to want to do. So it was kind of like one and one, like Lily Anderson, who I guess didn't make it, but had The Only Thing Worse Than Me Is You, which was this fantastic comedy. I'm like, all right, Lily's safe to ask and is going to want to do comedy. And I think she was the first person I brought on. I knew Anna Marie was going to want to do something extremely queer. So that was pretty safe bet. It was going to be like Midsummer. So it was sort of step by step in that way. And then I didn't know if anyone was going to do histories. Brittany Cavallaro, I asked specifically to do a sonnet. And then Winter's Tale, I didn't know, I'm like, oh, what do I do that this doesn't really fit into either one? And we just kind of let it stand out. That's by Melissa Basher-Deuce. It's called Lost Girl. So that was a little bit different in that I wanted it to have that structure. And then the other part is His Hideous Heart for the classroom. What's so great about it, in addition to everything that Mark was describing, is that it has each Poe retelling and then also the full original story so that students don't have to buy 2 books separately. But for Shakespeare, it would have been way too long to put everything in. So this was an extra challenge for the authors, asking everybody to choose the epigraphs that they thought best represented the context of their story and really grounded what they were doing in the context of original Shakespeare. And so that's how we have those epigraphs in the book. But it's, obviously different from having the entire story in there like Poe. So for better or for worse, you don't have all the text there with you, but you do have the authors helping you focus on a specific point and seeing, a lot of them are just 2-line epigraphs, and you see how they blew up the tiniest little piece of Shakespeare into this, marvelous full-bodied story. And it is such a cool thing. And I just got to say, as an editor, just having the stories roll in is magic. It's so much work, but they come in and like each one's better than the last. And you're like, what? Like, I'm such a dork about them because it's just the coolest feeling. So, I can't say I recommend them to everybody, especially around tax time when they're a nightmare, but it is the greatest privilege. And I guess I see Ellie's back. So I'm going to cut myself off there.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That's, I think, a perfect way to close it. I completely would agree if I were editing an anthology, which, wow, so daunting, but it's such a beautiful result. Like, oh my God. And thank you all so much for being here today. Like, this was an amazing discussion. I am so excited for all of the upcoming projects you talked about also, like Frankenstein's Himbo and the the Gay Gatsby. I'm so excited about all of these. Anna Marie, I'm a huge Gatsby fan. We actually got to write Gatsby AUs in my high school, the whole thing. Anyway, thank you so much. This was an amazing discussion. Yeah, some quick notes to see us out. And thank you everyone for sharing your questions as well. Don't forget, you can still click the link in the chat box to get your own copy of this wonderful anthology. And to find out about more events, check out our website for us updated listings. You can follow our Children and Teens Department on social media. The handle is posted in the chat also. And you can watch our past events on our Politics and Prose YouTube channel. Thanks again, everyone. Keep reading widely and expanding your world. Stay safe, and it has been a literal honor.
Thank you.
Bye.